The NTSB report is out on November 960 Lima Papa, the 2022 Daher TBM 700 aircraft that crashed at Truckee Airport, California in snowy, icing conditions. This preliminary report adds new detail to the investigation. Let's check it out. There were 2 people on board the aircraft and 2 fatalities. Liron Petrushka and his wife Naomi, both who are rated pilots. The Petrushkas were based out of the Truckee area and had done a lot of flying recently in this newly acquired TBM aircraft, and they were entrepreneurs and tech investors from Silicon Valley. Apparently they sold a business back in 1999 that afforded them this lifestyle. The accident occurred at 6:37 local time, just as the sun was setting and the tower was closing for the day. The instrument approach they flew to get into Truckee was the RNAV GPS runway 20, which brings you in at an angle to runway 20, which is 4,654 feet long, and the other runway at Truckee, runway 29 and 11, is the larger 7,000-foot runway. The weather minimums for this approach for their category of aircraft for the straight-in would be 1 mile of visibility. The weather minimums for a circling approach out of this approach would require 1.25 to 1.5 miles of visibility, depending on category A or B, which category they are flying under. The weather at the time of the accident was reported as 3/4 mile visibility and light snow, ceiling overcast at 900 feet, temperature 30 degrees, dew point 30 degrees, so no temperature dew point spread, altimeter 29 or 66 inches. And a review of the video camera footage at the airport near the accident site revealed that the actual visibility at the time of the accident was under 34/10 of a statute mile. And that's based on this analysis here. Here's the clear day picture. Here's the time of the accident picture. This is taken from the security camera at the airport. And they measure the distance to these trees, which they can barely see out of the fog. This picture here at the time of the accident showing the fog is indicative of the temperature dew point spread of 0 degrees Celsius, plus it's below freezing at 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is saturated. This accident occurred on the missed approach portion of this instrument approach procedure shown by the dotted line here on the approach chart. The missed approach is to do a climbing right turn to 12,000 feet direct Groit and then on track 016 to Owega. You need to climb at a minimum of 270 feet per nautical mile to 7,700 feet. So the initial portion of this missed approach, you need the climb performance to outclimb the terrain, this bowl surrounded by higher terrain. Also, soundings in the area at 1900 were consistent with nimbostratus type clouds in the area producing light snow with cloud tops near 17,000 feet, and the sounding was also consistent with the possibility of light to moderate icing below 17,000 feet. At the time of the accident, it was snowing pretty heavily there at Truckee. The pilot and pilot-rated passenger, so apparently Naomi was a pilot as well, had flown from Truckee to Denver on March 27th to visit their family. The accident flight was the return flight back to their home airport. The pilot purchased the airplane in November of 2022 and had amassed over 250 hours flying it. And a lot of that flying was in and out of Truckee, so they were very familiar with the local area. The ADS-B data showed that following departure, the airplane turned to a westerly heading and eventually climbed to a cruise altitude of 30,000 feet, and the airplane continued on course until reaching 120 nautical miles from the airport of Truckee. The airplane then made a right turn to the north and a gradual descent to about 15,000 feet as it passed over Lake Tahoe. The track then turned to the northeast, directed to the initial approach fix, Woodpa, for the RNAV runway 20 instrument approach. And this is what that looks like. So looking at the ADS-B data on the track log here in FlightAware, the aircraft descended into the potentially icing conditions at 17,000 feet, right here at 09:17:52. The crash occurred about 09:37:28. So that put the aircraft in icing conditions for about 20 minutes or so. This late model of TBM aircraft is equipped with anti-icing, de-icing equipment. So nowadays, ADS-B technology has the ability to see what mode you are putting the autopilot on in the aircraft if your aircraft is so equipped. And this is the new information that adds a lot of depth to this accident report so far. The airplane passed over the final approach fix LUMO at 1832.37, and the NTSB data showed that immediately thereafter the approach mode was turned on and the altitude hold was turned off. So they're talking about the mode control panel of the autopilot. So the aircraft, of course, has been on autopilot this whole time so far, and it still is. The airplane continued along the approach path and continued to descend. The flight track then passed over the VDP, the visual descent point, at 1835.43 at about 121 knots and an approximate altitude of 6,475 feet MSL, which would put him right at the straight-in minimums for this instrument approach procedure. Approximately 20 seconds later, the track passed over the missed approach point at an altitude of 6,200 feet MSL, which is below minimums, and at 100 knots total inertial speed, and continued between that altitude and 6,100 feet until abeam the runway identifier numbers. Now, this late model of TBM aircraft does have a auto throttle, and it will automatically engage the missed approach mode of the autopilot, complete with auto throttle pushing the throttle up for you. However, the autopilot mode was turned off and the altitude increased as the airplane began a gradual 180-degree turn to the right. The airplane climbed to about 6,750 feet at the base of the turn. During the turn, the following selections were made on the autopilot: altitude hold on, altitude hold off, lateral mode, LNAV, on, autopilot on, LNAV off, a series of altitude selections ending up with 9,300 feet, and lastly, the autopilot was turned off at 1837.20 as the airplane passed over runway 11. So here's what this data looks like in Google Earth format. They're coming down the final approach course, 112 feet down to the missed approach point. Then we have altitude hold off, LNAV off, autopilot off, a bit of a descent a little bit below minimums, altitude hold on, 107 knots, altitude hold off, LNAV on, 109 knots. They start the right-hand turn following the course for the missed approach, but they're not doing the correct altitude and climbing procedure for the missed approach. 141 knots, LNAV off, autopilot on, then select an altitude selection of 7,000 feet, 7,900, 8,800 feet, and then 9,300 feet. Normally, you're supposed to have your missed approach altitude set in prior to hitting your missed approach point. And as they cross a beam runway 11, autopilot off, and then there's a loss of control of the aircraft. And here's the description of the loss of control of the aircraft. The airplane then momentarily climbed to about 6,850 feet, about 1,075 feet above the ground. While making a left turn, the turn tightened, and the last three ADSB returns, which showed a rapid decrease in altitude and increase in speed. The last ADSB return was at 1837.40 and indicated that the airplane was at an altitude of about 200 feet above the ground and 170 knots, 200 feet northeast of the first identified impact point. The air traffic control tower was closed at Truckee. The airport's NOTAMs reported that the VASI, or the Visual Approach Slope Indicator, lights were not operational on runway 20, the runway was initially making the approach into. And a review of the recorded audio for the CTAF, the common frequency, which is what you use after the tower is closed, revealed that when the airplane was 2.4 nautical miles from the runway surface, clicks can be heard consistent with the pilot attempting to activate the runway lights. That's how you turn on the runway lights, is by clicking the microphone in an effort to find the runway. So with this new data from the NTSB, we can begin to see more holes in the Swiss cheese model of accident investigation begin to line up. Aeronautical decision-making, stacking the odds against yourself as a pilot. We have a pilot attempting an instrument approach in snowy conditions in the mountains with the weather below minimums. The tower is closed, the sun is setting, the VASI lights are out on runway 20. just painting himself into a terrible corner. He's got less than 300 hours time in this new, highly capable TBM aircraft. And then here at the final missed approach portion of the approach, we see a lot of different button pushing going on and autopilot selection on or off. Was the pilot attempting to circle to land in a desperate attempt to get into this airport? Was there a misunderstanding with the automation and the new auto throttle feature of this aircraft in performing a automatic missed approach procedure with the aircraft? Was the autopilot selected off here in this final data point, or did the autopilot kick off? Was the aircraft being overcome by icing conditions during this turn? All we know is at this point where the autopilot was either turned off or kicked off, aircraft control was lost shortly thereafter. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.